In today's tutorial, we're going to be creating this alien looking egg. We're going to make it really simple and modern. We'll be using geometry nodes, so let's figure out how we can create this in Blender. In our default scene, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and then we'll change it from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor over here. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, zoom in, select the group input, and tap X to delete the default cube. Now this base effect is going to happen on an icosphere, so we'll search for an icosphere by pressing Shift A and typing in icosphere and connecting this mesh into the group output. Then we'll go ahead and make this a lot larger by changing the radius to something like 5, and now we'll use the dual mesh node to convert this from triangles to hexagons or pentagons. So let's search for the dual mesh and plug that in. So we'll just go ahead and start increasing the subdivisions till we get something that we like. So I think the subdivision value of 3 looks good enough, so we'll use this value for the rest of the tutorial. The next thing that we want to do is actually change this regular pattern into something a little more random. For that, we can search for a merge by distance node and plug that in after the dual mesh. Now since this is very regular, when we start increasing the distance, a few of them start getting merged together and a few of them don't, so we get this irregular pattern, which will look cooler when we actually convert this into a wireframe. However, to increase the randomness even more, we can use a set position node before the merge by distance and actually use a noise texture to play around with the offset. So let's search for a noise texture, and remember, noise texture moves everything up by 0.5, so we have to search for a vector math node and change it from add to subtract and subtract a value of 0.5 on all of the axes. Apart from that, to actually control the strength of the noise texture, we can search for another vector math node, and this time we'll have to change it from add to scale so that we can multiply it on each of the axes by this particular value. But for now, we'll plug it into the offset and then start playing around with the scale. So let's maybe increase it to a value of 2, and this is what we get. Of course, you can play around with the actual size of the noise texture to make it a lot smoother or a lot sharper by increasing the scale or reducing the scale, but I'll keep it at the default 5 for now. Next up, to actually convert this into a wireframe, what we can do is inset each of the faces and then delete the face that was inset. To inset faces in geometry nodes, we're going to use a technique that we've used multiple times before on this channel, which is searching for an extrude mesh node and actually extruding it by an offset scale of 0. We have to make sure that individual is checked so that there's an individual face added in right on top of the existing faces. Then we'll use a scale elements node to actually bring the size of the faces down, so we can scale it down by something like 0.8, but we see that the entire mesh was scaled down. We don't want that. We want only the new faces that were created to be scaled down, so we use this top selection and plug that into the selection. So that way you can see how the scaling actually happens, and we have an inset face on every single one of the original faces. Now we have to delete the faces that were just inset, so let's search for a delete geometry node and then take the same top selection and plug that into the selection. But again, we have to delete only the faces, so we'll change this from point to face, and this as well we can change from all to faces, and that way we get a wireframe of the shape that we want. The next thing that we have to do is give this wireframe some thickness, because right now these are just planes. To actually give it some thickness, we can extrude it again, so we'll search for an extrude mesh node and plug it in after the delete geometry. Now if we keep the individual checked, we get these gaps in between the extrusions. We don't want that, so we just remove individual, and that way they all stick together and they come out as a single wire. But when we extrude it, if we actually look inside, there are going to be holes in the mesh, so we have to fill this up by adding in the original geometry again. So we'll go ahead and search for a join geometry node, plug that in after the extrude mesh node, and then take this delete geometry and plug that in. Now as we already know, the normals would be flipped, so we're going to have to search for a flip faces node and plug that in right after the delete geometry node so that we have the normals facing in the right direction. Now this shape doesn't look too organic, so to make it look a lot more organic, we can search for a subdivision surface node and plug that in after the join geometry. Then we can increase the levels to make this much smoother. But to keep our viewport performance high, we'll just change the level to 2 and keep it like this and increase it to maybe 4 or 5 just before the final render. Now once you're happy with this particular setup, we can go ahead and make some more randomness to the motion by using in another set position node after the merge by distance. If we were to currently increase the scale value here too much, you can see there's a lot of distortion that occurs. So we generally want to keep this scale value fairly low at something like 2 or 3 to prevent too many artifacts. So even here we are getting a few artifacts, but 1 or 2 won't be too much of an issue. Maybe we can reduce this a little bit more to 1.8 to just reduce this artifact, but that should be all right. However, to increase the actual random roughness of this surface, we have to go ahead and use another set position node. So let's take this set position, press Shift D and plug it in after the merge by distance. Now for the noise texture, we can use the same noise texture and we can actually scale it up a little bit more. So let's press Shift D after selecting the scale node and then plugging this vector in here, and this time we'll increase the scale to maybe 2 and then plug that into the offset. Now of course, if you go too high with this, it's still going to get get distorted. So just tread lightly with the values till you get something that you're happy with. Also keep checking by increasing the subdivision surface levels, because sometimes adding in higher subdivision surface levels will also remove a few of the artifacts as well. If you feel like scaling it up is causing even more artifacts, you can actually scale it down as well and just play around with it, because this is also going to help you with the animation later on. Another thing that we can do to smoothen out all of these is actually searching for a set shade smooth node and plugging that in after the subdivision surface node, and that just makes everything smooth, and even these artifacts will be much lesser visible. Once you're done with that, you can search for a set material node and plug that in to finish off the geometry node tree as of now. For the material, we'll actually choose the default material itself because it's not being used for anything else. Remember, we'll come back to this section to actually animate the noise texture by changing this from 3D to 4D and playing around with the W slider. To make it perfectly looping, we'll be using a technique that we've used multiple times before. But before we get into the animation, let's go ahead and set all of our defaults as well as the texturing and the background and leave the animation for the end. So for our render defaults, we'll switch on ambient occlusion, bloom, and screen space reflections. Then for our animation defaults, we'll change our frame rate to 30 frames per second. We'll change the end frame to 150 so that it's a 5-second long animation. We'll change the output folder to wherever we want it to be. File format, we're going to choose FFmpeg video, and for the encoding, we're going to change the container from Matroska to MPEG-4, and we're going to keep an output quality of perceptually lossless. Next, we'll switch our geometry node tab to the shader editor, and we'll switch our viewport shading from solid to rendered so that we can actually see the changes that we're making. Then we'll select our geometry node object and play around with the material. So for the material, you'll see there is this subsurface slider. We're actually going to use subsurface for this animation. And you see when you increase subsurface all the way to 1, by default, you get this reddish color that comes above. And that's because of two reasons. Firstly, the wavelength of red is the longest, so it actually scatters the least. And that's why it's most likely that you'll be able to see red when there is some sort of subsurface occurring. But another reason that some people might argue with, although the validity of this particular statement is up for debate, is that most animals would have red blood, and that's why they keep the default as a slight reddish tint, because we use subsurface for mostly living organisms that have blood running through it. However, if you want to change this, you see there's a subsurface radius present, and this goes RGB. So because R is kept at 1, we have this slight reddish color. But for my animation, I want to make it greenish. So I'm actually going to change this to 0. I'm going to change the blue to 0 as well. And I'm going to increase the green to something really high. So maybe let's go with a value of something like 18. And that will just make the subsurface a weird greenish color, which I actually really like. It makes it this slimy, translucent-y color. So we'll leave it like that. Apart from that, I don't want this light to be present here. So I'll press Alt-G to clear location. And in here, I'll go to the light properties, change the power to something really high. Let's go with 10,000. And I'll make this also to be slightly greenish. So the combination of that actually looks really cool. And if you change the background to something fairly dark, you get this really sci-fi looking glowing object. However, for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm actually going to change the background all the way to white and do the rest of the animations with this sort of a setup. Now I'm going to press Shift A and search for a cylinder, which I'm going to use as my entire background object. So to place it correctly, I'll just press GZ and press down Control and move it up by 1 unit so that the base is perfectly at the origin and the 3D cursor is also at the origin. So I'll click Object, Set Origin to 3D Cursor so that the origin comes to the bottom. With the origin at the bottom, I can press S and just scale it up to a very large number. So let's go with something like 50, and that should make it fairly large enough to contain our entire sphere as well as the camera and things like that. However, now I want to move it down on the Z-axis till it's just below my object, or I can select the object and move it up by 5 units plus a little bit more so that it just comes on top of the floor. Along with that, I can select the light that I had and also press GZ and move it up to about the center of my object. Then with my background cylinder selected, I can press tab to go into edit mode. I can go to edge select mode by pressing this button, selecting one edge and pressing Alt Shift Select to select the entire edge ring. Then I can press Ctrl B to actually create a bevel and just bring it in a little bit and increase the number of cuts by scrolling on your scroll wheel, or you can manually type in a number just to make it really nice and smooth. Then I'll press right click, shade smooth. Then I'll select my camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, and then press RX90 to rotate it on the X-axis by 90 degrees, GZ to bring it up, and then GY to bring it back. Once I bring it back, I'll press 0 to go into my camera view and then continue positioning it by using the same GY command and just making sure that the entire object is present within my view. Once my object is present in view, I can always play around with the position and the rotations a little bit more, but I think I'll go with something like this itself as my final position for the camera. Next, you don't see too much of the ambient occlusion, so we'll go back to my render properties, expand ambient occlusion and increase the distance up to something like 20, and instantly you'll be able to see these really nice shadows get formed, which actually defines the structure of the egg. Then I'm also going to increase the factor up to 5, and now you can clearly see the egg, which looks really cool. Apart from that, I don't want this egg to just be a complete white, so I'll change the subsurface color as well to a slightly greenish color, and that just adds into the definition of the egg, and that looks good enough for me. Next, for my cylinder object, which is my background, I'll just press this plus button to create a new material. I'm going to increase the base color to a complete white, and I'm just going to increase the roughness as well all the way to 1, and that should make a seamless backdrop whose edge cannot be seen. Next, I'll select my camera, go to the camera properties, expand the viewport display, and increase passport out all the way to 1 so that I don't see anything outside the camera view. Now I'll finally do my animation. So the first thing is actually moving the camera around the egg. So I'll press Shift A, search for an empty plane axis, and just scale the plane axis up so that I can see it. If you can't see it, you might have your overlay switched off. So let's switch on overlays. And now I'll select my camera first and then Shift select the empty. If you can't select it from the viewport, you can always Control select it from the outliner over here. And now press Control P, set parent to object. Then with the empty selected, on frame 0, you can tap I, rotation, and then you can go to frame 150 and then type RZ 360 so that it goes through one full rotation, and then tap I, rotation. Then we have to come down here and hover over the timeline and press T, linear, so that it becomes a smooth loop. So if you play the animation, this is what it currently looks like. If you want a realistic idea of how fast it's going to be, you can change the playback from play every frame to frame dropping, and now you see this is the speed at which it's going to be rotating once it's rendered out at 30 frames per second. After that, we actually want this object to dynamically change shape. So we'll go back to the geometry node editor and play around with this noise texture value over here. So if you see, by playing around with this W value, we get this really cool type of motion, and we want to actually loop that. So we'll select this noise texture, press Shift D to create a duplicate, and we'll go back to frame 0 and we'll mix these two together using a mix color node. So just search for mix color and plug that in right after the first noise texture. For slot B, we can take the color of the second noise texture. Now we can change the value to 0 for the W on both the noise textures, and we can change the factor down to 0 while we're on frame 0. Then we'll hover over the W value and tap I, hover over the factor value and tap I, and then we'll change this W value to maybe 1 or 0.5. You'll have to play around with it so that you get an animation that suits your speed, and then I'll tap I. Then I'll go to frame 150, change this W value to 0, change the factor all the way to 1 and tap I, and remember to tap I over this W as well, and then change this W value to the negative of what the previous value was. So in my case, we had kept a value of +1. So in this case, I'm going to keep -1 and tap I. Now I'm going to have to shift select all three of these nodes, hover down here and tap A to select everything, T, and then linear. Now when we play the animation, you should be able to have these really cool movements occurring as well while the actual camera rotates about this object. So once you're done with that and you're happy with everything, you can go ahead and press render animation, and you should get something that looks like this. Thank you so much for watching through this entire tutorial. If you actually enjoyed this tutorial, be sure to check out other tutorials on my channel as well. I release a video every single day, so I'm sure you're gonna have fun with the future videos that are going to come up as well. Until the next video comes out, if you have any questions, comment them down below and keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.